welcome. So grateful that you're here today. My name is Amy Stevens, and I am the museum director. I also curated the exhibit that you're going to learn more about today about Nancy Drew. Let me introduce a few staff members, and then I'll go through the agenda for today, okay? We have Anna Studstill in the green dress. You saw her checking in, and she is going to be helping with technology. We have a board member, Eric Tapia, and he's also photographing and helping with technology. And you met at the desk, Sarah Minton. So if you have any questions, please let us know. We have restrooms straight through in the children's room, as well as by the front door, okay? So just for those of you who are on Zoom and in person, we have a very broad audience for Nancy Drew. And I think that's so cool. And that is the beauty of this sleuth who started in 1930 and is still going strong today. We have a Girl Scout troop here, and so we have lots of girls in the 7, 10, 11, 13 range. We have some senior citizens and some volunteers from the museum here. We just have a little bit of everyone. And then we also have people on Zoom that are watching in. So we're very glad you're here. As a way of introduction for today, we are going to start off with a quick, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the exhibit. So as you have free time today, you can enjoy it more. I have a special artifact to show you, and I can't wait. It's really super wonderful and valuable. We are going to then visit with Miss Jennifer Fisher. She is America's foremost historian about Nancy Drew. She's written books. She's done a lot of research about the original writer, and I can't wait for you to hear her. And then we're going to take a little bit of a break, okay? So we won't be sitting the whole time. You'll have a restroom break, and then we'll get back and do a couple of little mini mysteries together, and then a live reading of a radio script, which some of you may want to be some of the actors in the show. We'll just be reading it, no memorization expected. And we also will have some sound effects that all of you can help us with. So if you know how to chirp like a bird, and if you know the theme to Star Wars, you're going to be just fine, okay? All right. Well, I want to tell you the reason we're doing this today. It has to do with the exhibit over here in this corner. And I'm sorry that our online people can't see it, but this is a 1980s exhibit about how Edmund life was in the 1980s. Well, it just so happens that there are a couple of things on that exhibit are from my 1980s life. And we put out a Nancy Drew and a Hardy Boys book because that was a big part of my childhood and teen years. And it seemed like the perfect time to do an exhibit about Nancy Drew and just kind of celebrate her almost 100-year history. So that's kind of how this got started. And then I started looking at my personal collection because I read them as a kid. I started in 2nd grade reading those books. And just over the years when I was traveling, I'd pick up a copy here and there and assimilated quite a collection. And in fact, in 2014, I met Miss Jennifer here because I went to the Nancy Drew fan conference. I mean, I'm really a fan in California, and I got to learn so much more. And so I've stayed in connection with her since then. So that's kind of how this got started. All right, I want to take just a pause real quick because we have some more people that have come in. Make sure, do we need more seats or anything? Okay, great. Yes, and feel free if you are more comfortable going to the edges, if you want to spread out a little bit more, depending on your comfort level with all the things going on. Please feel free to move as you choose, okay? So I'm going to put my mask back on, and we're going to walk over to the exhibit. I'm going to give you a quick overview, and then we'll be back to talk to Jennifer, okay? All right, we're going to head over to the back here.
Sarah liked.
Now, I expect that there are a few people in the audience today that have not read Nancy Drew, and that is okay, because maybe you'll want to when we're done. But if you read Nancy Drew at any point in your life, please raise your hand. All right. There's a bunch of you at different ages. So as I was putting this exhibit together, I started thinking about the books I read. And the ones I read had that yellow spine. They're even called yellow spine. That's what we know them by. I didn't know there was anything else. It turns out that was the second version. The first books came out in 1930. 1930, that was so long ago. And I've got an example of one of those in here. Well, after 30 some years, they decided they're still popular. We need to rewrite them and make them a little more modern, take out some of the controversial things, you know, as culture had changed. And so they brought them out as yellow spine books, and they continue to do well. And now they still have books coming out. And maybe some of the girls here in the front read some of the Drew Clue books that are where Nancy and her friends are in elementary school. There are movies out. There's a movie from 1938, and there's a movie that came out just a couple of years ago. So it just spans culture. So in this case, when you get a chance to look further, it breaks it down by decades. So you kind of see the changes over time. Joyce, you said to me the other day, I didn't know she was still coming out. You just thought those books that you read as a kid were it. She's still very alive today. However, we also wanted to tie in Edmund culture because that's what our museum is about, telling Edmund's story. So I pulled artifacts from our collection that would have been from 1930 or early 40s, and Nancy Drew was written. Found some real treasures. Over here in this corner is an Underwood typewriter. It's kind of cool looking, right? If you haven't had a chance to ever type on one of these, this one is for you to touch. Try it. Just get your fingers on that early keyboard, okay? But as we were looking at representing a 1930s typewriter that might have been used by Carolyn Kane to write the first Nancy Drew book, I got to looking at the one in the Smithsonian Institute that Nancy Drew was really written on. It's almost identical. We think it might be the same issue. It might have been issued the same year, so it's almost exactly like those original books were written from. So that is just really cool. There are other little mysteries throughout this exhibit. I have artifacts out, but you don't really know the full story of the artifact until you read a little bit more and solve the clues, okay? So if you have time, please do that. Some are harder than others. This one is probably the hardest in the purple, okay? So don't start with that one. There are also activities throughout the museum. Some of them are picture matches. For example, I'm gonna walk over here. Jennifer Fisher, our speaker today, was the consultant on some Nancy Drew paper dolls that came out a few years ago. And the paper doll clothes match the original book covers. So you can come over here and look and match those up. And then we also did hairstyles. Hairstyles on the covers of the book changed over the years. So there's just so much culture for you to learn. I also want to share with you that we had one more museum jump in and help. Over here in the corner, you'll see a toy pigeon and some little metal canisters. Well, it turns out the opening page of the Password to Larkspur Lane, a pigeon drops down into Nancy Drew's front yard, and it has a secret message and a capsule on her leg. So I got in touch with the American Pigeon Museum, which is here in Oklahoma City, by the way. It's a great museum. And they said, yes, we have some of those capsules from World War II when they used to send spy messages to each other. So there's Nancy Drew culture and something in a museum here in our state ties in together. So those are on loan for you to see. Now, when we get back to our seat in just a moment, I want to show you that very special artifact that I told you about because it just came in this week. And when you see it, you'll realize immediately why I think it's a hat that looks very much like a hat on the very first 1930s book. Okay? So let's head back to our seats and get comfortable.
One second.
I know, I'm so excited. When I saw this, I about came back to Luke because it's beautiful. Okay, I think I'm going to set it on this table for a second. Bring it out. It might be helpful if you saw. I don't have it with me. When you get back over to the exhibit, please look at the cover of the first couple of Nancy Drews, and you'll see that she's wearing what's called a cloche hat. And this was very popular when that book came out in 1930. Look what we got this week. Isn't that beautiful? It looks very much like the one Nancy Drew is wearing on the cover. It has velvet ribbons on it to make the flowers. I just was so excited to get this. We at the museum have about 41,000 artifacts, and they tell the story of our town. And a woman in Edmond wore this in the late 1920s, and this would have been popular when Nancy Drew came out. Isn't it beautiful? If you'd like to see it further when we get done at the end, let me know and I'll open it up again. All right. Now we're going to turn it over to Miss Jennifer Fisher, and she's going to talk a little bit about Nancy Drew over time and how she has modernized, and also a little bit about her amazing personal collection. Jennifer?
Thank you, Amy. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for having me today. I am very excited to talk about, obviously, one of my favorite topics, and tell you a little bit more about the history behind Nancy Drew, a little bit on collecting Nancy Drew, sort of how she's become an icon and this sort of pop culture figure over the years, and then just a little nostalgia at the end. Let me bring up my presentation, so I will be right back.
Was he able to sort it out? Oh, all right.
All right. Can everybody see that?
We can see it here.
Okay, good. All right. So my talk is going to be about Nancy Drew and her mysterious history. So we will delve right in. But first, I want to talk a little bit about how I came to be a Nancy Drew fan and so knowledgeable about Nancy Drew. Probably like most of you, I read these books as a kid. They were my absolute favorite series. This is a shot from my bedroom when I was a little kid. And you can kind of see on the bottom right, a little small shelf where I had a bunch of my yellow spine Nancy Drew books. This was taken probably by the very end of the 1970s or very early 1980s. And those were some of my favorite books. By the time I got to college and law school, I had made these sort of makeshift shelves, and I had always saved my childhood books. So I brought those from home with me, and then I kind of began adding to it. So you can see a real hodgepodge of Nancy Drew books here, spanning from, did we lose me? Let's see. I lost it on my screen. Let's see.
We also lost your screen.
Is it back?
Not yet.
Okay, try this. There we go. Somehow I got out of there. Sorry about that, everybody. A little technical difficulty. Let's see if that works. Okay, there we go. So scrolling back. It's a hodgepodge of Nancy Drew books, and I had been going to antique malls, used bookstores. This was before eBay was really big, or I had even heard of it in the late 90s. And then eventually, over time, quite a few years, my collection expanded rapidly, thanks to eBay mostly, because you can find anything on there just about. I still love to sleuth locally and all of those things, but my passion for Nancy Drew, I think I love mysteries. So I read lots of different books besides Nancy Drew, lots of different, childhood books, but Nancy Drew was always the one that stuck with me. That was always my favorite. And I think, her character, she was such a bold and independent girl. And she just loved solving mysteries, and she loved to right wrongs and seek justice for others. And, she had these neat friends and got to go on all these wonderful adventures. And it just resonated with me. It was so inspiring. And so, I read them as a kid. I saved my books. I read them as new parts of Nancy Drew were evolving, like the more modern books, the paperbacks, the spin-off series like The Files hit right as I was at that age level for those books for the older teens. So I rolled with Nancy Drew as she kind of evolved into the modern era. I went off to law school, and I was at an antique mall, and I had quit buying, new releases. At that point, I was focused on college and then law school. And I saw a vintage Nancy Drew book from the 1930s, and it was so fascinating to me. And that led me sort of to this journey of meeting other online collectors that were gathering at different, message board sites, and eBay was becoming a thing. And so people were selling and buying on there. And I met different collectors that had been at it for a while, and sort of fell down the rabbit hole of Nancy Drew collecting. And, then it sort of evolved where we had an online discussion group called Nancy Drew Sleuths. And from there, it sort of snowballed into having Nancy Drew conventions. And you can see Amy in this picture. Actually, this was the first time I met her, the San Diego convention in 2014, at one of our mystery dinners. And so, we got together as a discussion group. We discussed the books, we traded books, we met other collectors. It was so much fun. And then we sort of evolved into having conventions. Our first unofficial convention was in Toledo, Ohio in 2001, where just a few of us went to meet the original Carolyn Kane, Mildred Benson, who was still alive in her mid-90s, still working as a journalist. And so we decided we needed to meet her. I mean, some other fans had met her about nearly a decade before that at a Nancy Drew conference, but this was sort of, a lot of us had not met her, so that we're there. So it was fun to get to go on that journey. And from then on out, everybody wanted to keep getting together every year. So we started having conventions. We started having a series zine called The Sleuth, where people write about Nancy Drew. I began to consult and write about Nancy Drew. I was able to publish Clues for Real Life for Meredith Books, who had me compile the book. And then having met her and then begun researching behind the scenes, because I found the history so fascinating. I've been haphazardly working on a biography about Mildred Benson. She was the original Carolyn Kane, who wrote 23 of the first 30 Nancy Drew books. And this is just a montage of some images of her over the years. On the far left, you can see her around the age she was writing Nancy Drew way back. And so I've been, writing about her, researching about her, and working on this book, which has been a lot of fun. And after 20 some odd years of collecting Nancy Drew, the Toledo Public Library in Toledo, Ohio, was very interested in having me donate my collection. I had mentioned it to them several years before 2019, but they went through this major renovation, to make a long story short, and were doing lots of renovating throughout the main downtown public library. And so they were able to kind of create a space for my collection and asked me, would you be willing to donate it now? I had sort of thought I would donate it down the road when I'm, retired, living the senior life, having fun, and no, it ended up happening in 2019, which was fine. I'm very happy that I ended up doing it then, because it gets to serve a greater purpose. The public gets to see it, they get to enjoy it. They get to be inspired by it. New Nancy Drew readers, new collectors, scholars get to take a look at it. I took these photos when I visited. They have lots of really neat things in the downtown library. They have this diorama of Nancy Drew. They have lots of other things related to Nancy Drew there, and the original ghostwriter who lived in Toledo most of her adult life and wrote quite a few Nancy Drew books there. We were setting up the collection in the room when I took some of these photos. And on the right, they also have the original painting for book number 5, Secret at Shadow Ranch, which was done by illustrator Russell Tandy. And it hangs in there too, which is so cool. It's a really neat cover. And so that's sort of my brief interlude into how I got into all of this. But I've loved Nancy Drew as a character. I've loved the books. I love the history behind it and the people that helped create Nancy Drew. And that's sort of what's fueled my desire to collect and research and write about her all these years now. I also love meeting fans and hearing everybody's story about Nancy Drew and what inspires them. So first, we're going to delve into the history behind the mystery. And this is Nancy Drew. Amy was talking about the hat and the covers. This was the first cover for The Secret of the Old Clock, this image of Nancy with her cloche hat. Just briefly, there's some resources for history about Nancy Drew. There's my website. I did a blog on 31 blogs on all things Nancy Drew, all different aspects of Nancy Drew history, collecting, fan groups, all sorts of fun things if you go to my blog. And then, of course, you can visit the collection at the Toledo Public Library. And eventually it will be digitized, so you can visit it online. So this is how Nancy Drew looked back in 1930 when the series first debuted. This is an actual image of a first printing dust jacket and book. So you can see on the book, there's no silhouette at that time for 1930 to 1932, or the beginnings of 1932. This is how the style looked. That's what the dust jacket looked like. And then as you can see on the reverse of the dust jacket here on the far right, you can see underneath the dust jacket, they had lots of series titles. The first 3 books were published April 28, 1930. So the dust jacket for Old Clock lists the first 3 books. You may be wondering who dreamed up Nancy Drew, and that would be Edward Strathemire, who you can see pictured here. He's the one that created Nancy Drew. I like to sort of call him the inventor of Nancy Drew. He had been working on a series proposal for Nancy Drew, what would become Nancy Drew. And Mildred Benson, who I mentioned before, had been writing for him for a little while on another series that the Strathemire Syndicate produced. The Strathemire Syndicate was the brainchild of Edward Strathemire. It formed around 1905, and it was like a book packager. So what they would do is they would create series. They would get permission from a publisher to start creating that series. They would be interested in it, publishing it. And so the series would be formed. Strathemire would create the characters, the starting characters. He would create outlines for the books, and he would farm them out to ghostwriters for his different series. And the ghostwriters would sign a release, assigning away the rights to the character, the pen name, the stories, and so forth for a flat fee. They did not get any royalties. They just were paid a flat fee, which at the time was actually pretty good money for about a month or sometimes less work. So it was actually pretty good money as well. A lot of times, and people like Mildred or other journalists, even, he had a lot of journalists working for him, would do these sort of side jobs, writing these books, because the money was pretty good at the time. Of course, most of these people didn't realize at that time, over time, 90 plus years later, these series would still be popular and in print. So Mildred was his pick for writing Nancy Drew. And he asked her to write for the series. And she was only 24 when the first 3 books were written and came out. She was sort of in between college, and she had gone back and gotten her master's in journalism. and then was sort of in kind of a limbo where she was, had done some newspaper work, but then had moved to Ohio. And first she lived in Cleveland. So this is Strathemire with his daughter Edna on the left. Strathemire passed away tragically just barely 2 weeks after the Nancy Drew series debuted. He died of pneumonia. And so his two daughters, Edna and Harriet, kind of carried on the business. This was during the Depression, so it was a difficult time for trying to sell the business. They did try to find a buyer, but that was not really a workable solution. So the two sisters, which is pretty amazing for women at the time, decided to continue to run their father's company and deal with publishers and ghostwriters and just carry on the business. And, something that it was a very male-dominated industry at the time. So that was sort of very unusual, but they took to it really well. This is the other daughter, Harriet, that I mentioned in the syndicate offices here. You can see lots of their series books behind her. So the two sisters carried on. They both worked on outlines and even created the Dana Girls series. That was another Carolyn Kane pseudonym series. So what I'd like to just go through briefly for you guys is what I call the Drew team. And these are all the people who collectively helped to sort of create and foster and bring Nancy Drew to life and distribute her throughout the country through the publishing team that sort of really helped make Nancy Drew such an enduring popular figure in the beginning in 1930 and throughout. So at the very top left, we have Edward Strathemire. Next to him is Mildred Benson, original ghostwriter. Next to her, we have Russell Tandy, and he's the original illustrator for the Nancy Drew books. He did both the covers and internal illustrations. Next to him is Strathemire's daughter, Edna. Now, Edna was more principally involved with the Nancy Drew series in the 1930s than her sister Harriet, who did have some involvement, but became much more involved with Nancy Drew from the 40s on. Middle to the left is Harriet. Now on the middle right, you can see the montage of the model. This was one of the models for Nancy Drew. Her name was Grace Horton. And underneath, there's a couple of Nancy Drew images that are similar to Grace. Tandy used her as a model beginning late 1930s into the 40s. But she's one of the most iconic models for Nancy Drew. We don't really know who the original model was back from the early 30s. Now, on the very bottom left, we have Harriet Otis Smith. Strathemire had an assistant at the syndicate. She was like his right-hand woman. Her name was Harriet Otis Smith, and she stayed with the company through just a few months after Strathemire passed away. She helped the two sisters sort of take control and learn the business more than they had, learned it previously. They had done some work for their dad at home, helping edit manuscripts and things like that, but they had never run a company like this. So Harriet sort of helped with the transition and then went on her merry way when the sisters moved the company from New York City to New Jersey. Next to Harriet Otis Smith is a naval man named Walter Carrick. He wrote 3 Nancy Drew books during the Depression when Mildred refused to take a pay cut. And so he wrote books 8 through 10, Nancy's Mysterious Letter, The Sign of the Twisted Candles, and The Password to Larkspur Lane. And so his take on Nancy Drew was similar to Wirt's. He seemed to have a little more humor and was interesting in the way he would describe the girls and what they were doing and the shopping and all of that as compared to Mildred. But they flow well together. So if you're reading the series from the beginning, those original versions, you don't notice a huge difference between ghostwriter to ghostwriter like you do down the road when that started changing. And then the final 2 people here on the right are Alexander, Grosson and Dunlap. They were the publishers that had published the series from the beginning up until the 1980 or 1979 when they switched to a different publisher, Simon & Schuster, who currently publishes modern Nancy Drew books. So this is where I'm going to just briefly bring up a couple of things you might want to know about Nancy Drew in history, a couple little fun facts. The books were revised, some of them. There's a classic set of 1 through 56, and those are the hardcovers that came out between 1930 and 1979. The first 34 were revised beginning in the late 1950s. The main reasons for being revised, the publisher was starting to shorten the books, and it was cheaper to produce a 20-chapter book than a 25-chapter book. So if you have a book between 1 and 34, and it has 25 chapters, that is an original text. It's going to be around 200 plus pages. The revised versions have 20 chapters and are around 180 plus or minus pages. So that's one way to tell the difference. Some of the stories became very different when revised, not very many, but I've met some collectors who read the book as a child who then picked it up later down the road, and they didn't realize they were picking up the revised version, and it was a completely different story, and they couldn't believe, they thought their memories were, skewed from what they read as a kid, but no, the books had been revised. Also in revising them, they were able to remove, stereotypes, and different things like that, outdated language. For example, in the 30s, in these books, there was a novelty about having electric lights. So that would be mentioned in the books. Well, by the time they were revised, electricity in homes was pretty standard in most areas. So they would remove terminology like that. Eventually, her roadster morphed into a convertible down the road. So they changed terminology. I mentioned that the publishers changed in 1979. The syndicate decided to switch publishers from Grosset to Simon & Schuster, which resulted in a huge lawsuit between the publishers and the syndicate. And the end result was that Grosset and Dunlap would be able to keep reprinting those first 56 books, and they still do today through Penguin Putnam or Penguin Random House now. And so you can find those sort of glossy, shiny, what we call flashlight covers, where there's a little banner across the top with a little flashlight symbol. And those are still being reprinted today. And then Simon & Schuster would get to publish all new books. So from number 57 onward, we had continued the series, but it was in paperback. And then Simon & Schuster, by the mid-'80s, began releasing newer spin-off series and more modern versions of Nancy Drew. And they still publish her today. And I will show you those books very shortly. When we get into collecting Nancy Drew 101. So if you're interested in collecting Nancy Drew, I have a few resources here and where areas you can go to find more about collecting. You don't have to collect a huge collection. If you're just interested in something small or just things that pique your interest, stories that interest you, books maybe you read as a child but didn't keep and you want to go back and rediscover those books, or maybe you want to collect the vintage versions that you just discovered because of my talk, if you're new to this. So on Pinterest / Nancy Drew Expert, I have a whole bunch of boards that talk about all the different Nancy Drew collectibles. There's images of lots of the collectibles and paper ephemera and interesting historical items from my collection. And you can see all of that very visually there. You can go to my website at nancydrewsleuth.com, where there's lots of collecting and also history. The 31 blogs I mentioned go into a lot of variations of different books and collectibles that are out there. And again, you can visit Toledo Public Library and see everything in person. Did you know there's been over 600 cases solved since 1930? This year, she hit 675 different books. Now, you're probably thinking, how could there possibly be 675 Nancy Drew books? But it's, so many variations over the years, spin-off series, revised versions. It just all adds up because there have been so many different books over the years. So if you want to collect one of every Nancy Drew book published, your goal is 675 and counting because they're still publishing her. So I thought right here we would scroll through just a little bit about how Nancy Drew looked over the years and what these vintage books looked like. We're starting with the 30s here, and you can see that familiar cloche hat and the way she was dressed. She was always very sophisticated looking, especially back then, and always dressed in the latest fashions. And as we're scrolling through, you can see more of the 30s covers. And then we segue into the 40s here, and you can see how her looks changed, the hairstyles changed. During the 40s, she was often painted in red or blue with white accents, sort of very patriotic, because we were involved in World War II. Though in the books, that was never mentioned because the syndicate did not like to date their books. Here we are still in the 1940s. And then right here, we get into the 1950s by The Secret of the Wooden Lady. And that was the first cover from Bill Gillies, a new illustrator. Tandy's last cover was Leaning Chimney. So Bill Gillies he redid some original covers 1 through 9 and 11, and possibly 10, though it only came out in the UK. And he did a few more covers, The Black Keys, Ski Jump, in addition to Wooden Lady. And then here we're getting into Rudy Nappy, the third and final illustrator of the classic books, who did the most covers going forward and went back and redid a lot of the previous covers as they, over time, would change cover art. And so here we go through the 50s and we start getting into the 60s. And by the 60s, you can see how Nancy Drew has evolved fashion-wise, and her hair color is now what they call Titian, later strawberry blonde, but she was a little redheaded. Some very iconic covers from the 60s. And then we get into the 70s, where you can see how the covers definitely changed and how they looked. And then we have some redone covers I'm showing you from that period that Nappy redid from earlier versions. And then on the very far right, we get into the paperbacks beginning at number 57 onward, illustrated by Ruth Sanderson. The Triple Hoax was the first Nancy Drew paperback that came out in 1979 that sort of spawned that lawsuit that I mentioned between the publishers. And so we're just going to go over some of Nancy Drew's looks through the years on the paperback covers in the classic series. The classic series had 175 books total by 2003. And this is just, again, how she sort of looked over the years on these covers. 2004, we had Nancy Drew Girl Detective, which debuted, and it replaced the classic series. And it was like the new kind of 8 to 12 set for the kids. And that on the far right is one of the Girl Detective books. Over time, by Girl Detective, even in those classic paperbacks, there were certain ways that they modernized Nancy Drew, not just in how she looked, but in how the stories were written. But overall, they stayed pretty close to the classic formula. By Girl Detective, we have Nancy Drew written in first person. We have her driving a hybrid car. She becomes a little more bumbling and forgetful than we're used to. And her friends Bess and George have certainly morphed into something different. Bess has become sort of mechanical. She has mechanical skills, if you can believe that. And George is a computer hacker. So they've definitely kind of jumped into the modern era in that series. Here's a couple other versions of Nancy Drew. We had, beginning in the 90s, the Nancy Drew Notebook series, which was Nancy Drew as an 8-year-old solving mysteries at school. And they're cute little chapter books for more like a 6 to 9-year-old set, replaced eventually by Nancy Drew and the Clue Crew, same format, which is now Nancy Drew Clue Book. And those are the current ones being published, where she's 8 years old solving mysteries. In 1986, the Nancy Drew Files debuted. And on the right are a couple of covers from that series. There was 124 books over time published in that series. They were for older teens. I was reading these as they came out. That was right at my age level. I always have a fondness for the Files, although I prefer, obviously, classic Nancy Drew. But there was more romance in these books than the originals, and there were murders. Nancy did not solve murders in the classic series, but in the Files, there were murders. Back in about 10 years ago, they did these new covers for the first few books. They sort of did different art. They weren't replacing the nappy art that you'll find on the books still published, but for a little bit, they came out with these cute little covers for several of the books. And then at some point, we had Nancy Drew Diaries replace Girl Detective. It is the current in-print series by Simon & Schuster. And it's you know, similar in that it's in first person. It's a little more, she's more like her old self in the classic. She's not so forgetful and odd like in Girl Detective. And we also went back to having, you know, regular illustrated covers because Girl Detective used a lot of clip art, which wasn't the most visually appealing. If you really want to get into modern Nancy Drew, we've had graphic novels like the one on the left by Paper Cuts based on the Clue Crew series. There were also ones based on the Girl Detective series. And then we have comic books from Dynamite Comics. There's been several different series that they've released, written by Anthony Del Cole and some other authors. Those are fun if you're into comics. So there's something for every Nancy Drew fan. Now, if you want to get into collecting, I'm just going to briefly scroll through what you can find at my website. If you go to the collecting section, I break it down into several categories. The dust jackets, the boards. These were the way the books looked in the 30s and 40s and 50s into the early 60s. They had dust jackets and they had some sort of form of blue boards. The last form was blue tweed, kind of a tweedy pattern. Then we went into the early 60s into the picture cover format. I also showcased the end papers that you would find inside either version of books. You can look at information about the text, the authors, get a list of who wrote what, who revised what, when books were revised. There's even collecting and selling tips and, you know, illustration information. So you can click on the different sections. Just briefly, I'll just scroll through and show you like the formats through the years. So as you can see on the left, we have, you know, the white spine dust jackets into a wrap spine dust jacket into the picture covers. Left is earliest, right is later. And then the boards of the books for the dust jackets, going from no silhouette to different styles of silhouette to the blue tweeds on the right. And then the end paper is used in these books over the years, going from blank to silhouettes to some being printed with another series end papers. Those were the Dana girls. They're staring at a note in the kind of maroon color, second from right on the top there. And then the Digger end papers, and on the bottom row, different multi-scenes of Nancy Drew in different shades, and then these oval images. So you can look at all these different formats. And I have charts on my website. You know, it's broken down by, for example, wrap spine dust jackets, what sort of formats come in those. You can see what books were published in that format. So you can really detail how you want to collect and the information you want to use for what you want to find as you're collecting. Sections on the yellow spine picture covers and those different formats, and even a little bit of information about those glossy ones I was talking about that are still published today in this style. These are samples of what you would find in the collecting section where, you know, I have different charts that help break down what came out in these different formats. For example, if you wanted to get a uniform set of books for the dust jacketed books, they were the first 38 books. The only format that is going to be totally in sync with each other is the blue tweed format, because every book was eventually reprinted in that style. If you want something uniform on your shelves. Otherwise, you know, a hodgepodge of 30s to early 60s for dust jackets is always fun. And so these are just more examples of how I break down everything on my website. So please visit the website and you'll be able to, you know, see all of these variations. And maybe it'll inspire you to collect something vintage or just something that piques your interest. There were definitely lots of cover art, and you can see those in the library section under the classic books and other different sections. Some books had 2 covers, only 2. One book had 4 covers. Most books had, for the first 34, had 3 different cover art. And then, of course, beginning with number 35, when they started having 20 chapters, there was only 1 cover art. There are other variations of Nancy Drew you can collect. On the left are library editions. There's so many styles of those. Book club editions like the one in the middle, and foreign editions. Nancy Drew has been reprinted in so many different languages. I think we're up to 27 to 29, depending on what source you're looking at. But there are at nancydrewworld.com, if you're interested in all the different countries and different books for the different foreign editions, you can visit that. And so those are fun. Applewood Books reprinted some of the originals, the first 21. You can find those editions. And then we segue into sort of collectibles based on books, but collectibles also based on movies and television. These are images of Benita Granville, who played Nancy Drew in the 1930s movies. So all sorts of fun collectibles from those movies. There was Nancy Drew on TV in the 70s with Pamela Sue Martin. Warner Brothers had a movie in 2007 with Emma Roberts. There's lots of memorabilia for that. And there's all kinds of fun collectibles. The game is based on the books, that board game, the Nancy Drew mystery game. The costume on the right is based on the 70s TV show. There were dolls from Madame Alexander. There was a cookbook, a diary that also comes in a white version, an ornament. There's lots of computer games. So if you're into Nancy Drew computer games, Her Interactive has produced a lot of games, and you can go to herinteractive.com and purchase all sorts of fun games and solve mysteries as Nancy Drew. There were lots of fun collectibles like these cereal premiums, the little paint books based on Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys. Those were fun to collect. A lunchbox from the television series. And so these are some of just an overview of some of the different collectibles. Like I said, there's collectibles based on the books, the movies, the television shows. And now in modern era, there are a lot of companies that are licensing Nancy Drew and creating puzzles and other fun items. It just, we license Nancy Drew for our own line of merchandise that we sell at our website. So there's all sorts of fun things you can collect and sort of show your Nancy Drew, inner Nancy Drew, with all these fun things. Again, if you go to my Pinterest page, you can see so many hundreds and hundreds, thousands of collectibles that are out there. Some are more scarce than others. Some I just happen to find, at eBay randomly. That was one source that really helped me expand my collection. And I'm still collecting. I still collect for the collection in Toledo because, I donated it many years before I planned to. So it was never complete. It was pretty complete overall, but there's still some things that, I'm seeking. And then there's modern stuff being created and produced all the time that get added to it. And then I still collect for myself. I have a sort of smaller secondary collection here at the house that I have for fun and for research and writing purposes. So that's just kind of an overview of Nancy Drew books and collectibles. And now I thought it would be fun to just sort of wrap up with some Nancy Drew nostalgia. Things we learned from Nancy Drew with a few quotes from my Clues book. Just kind of going back down memory lane with some of these vintage images from the books. In the sleuthing business, there was always eavesdropping, one of Nancy Drew's trademarks. There was always something interesting to be overheard. When you're unusually good at what you do, the police will yearn for your women's intuition. That was from The Clue of the Leaning Chimney. Nancy dealt with snooty villains. She was locked in closets and left to starve. You have to love these Russell Tandy images from the 30s. They're just beautiful. There were ruses to get clues. And of course, always threats to drop the case or else. After being kidnapped, it's only proper to take a bath and change your clothes before reporting the crime to the police. Nancy Drew was nothing but polite in these books. She was often bound and gagged and made puzzling discoveries in very spooky places. And then, of course, we had swell chums. At first, it was Helen Corning and then Bess and George. You can always talk a loyal friend into joining you in your schemes and ruses. No matter what the mystery, she always managed to rope Bess and George into joining her. She tangled with cliffhanger moments like this on the left, where she was left bound on a ship that was set on fire, discovered hidden staircases. She evaded villains. And of course, there were always phone threats to stay off the case or else. There were dastardly villains she had to contend with. When people irritate you, it's best to stifle a snarky retort and not let them get the best of you. No matter how irritated Nancy was, she would still try to be her polite self, just solve the mystery and get them in the end. And some people's favorite are the Travelogues, which are books where she traveled to real life places. You know you're clues obsessed when you can't imagine a vacation without a mystery to solve. And there were always trips with mysteries or mysteries that brought her to taking trips and vacations to her friend's chagrin. Tailing suspects, coming to people's rescue, those were staples of these books. Red lipstick makes a great window SOS when you've been kidnapped and stolen away on a plane. And here is that iconic image from Mystery of the Fire Dragon. And it's so funny to me because it's, Nancy's on this plane, she's been bound, and she gets out her red lipstick and writes a backwards, mind you, SOS on the window. And for most of us, nobody would ever see that. But there is a plane that happens to be nearby that sees it and brings help. She tangled with snakes and other wildlife. There were spooky attics, stakeouts. And those are some of the fun Nancy Drew images that I look back on and enjoy revisiting Nancy Drew and all those fun adventures we went on with her in our childhood. Just to wrap up, here are some resources again, my Pinterest, my website, if you're interested in our fan group, Nancy Drew Sleuths, our conventions and everything like that, we are at nancydrewfans.com. And then my blog, which has lots of information about Nancy Drew as well. And I will get back to the Zoom. There we go. All right.
All right.
So I hope that I hope you enjoyed that and learned a little bit about Nancy Drew and are inspired to read the books, read them again, or maybe even collect.
All right. So I think we have a couple of minutes for questions. If there are any questions, either both in person or anyone via Zoom. Yeah.
So when they did the revisions on the second series, did they do that because of, events at the time, or was it because it was a different writer? Or, you know what I'm talking about? Like the first editions.
No. What they did was in the 1950s, the publisher Fawcett and Dunlap had begun sort of changing over the format to a 20 chapter format. So book number 35 was written with just 20 chapters and published that way. And they reached out to the syndicate and basically told them that they needed to revise the first 34 books. There was a couple issues with that. It was cheaper to publish a 20 chapter book than a 25 chapter. That was a main factor in it. It was economics. Also, children's reading spans were not the same, so they were shortening the books. And then 3, the printing press, the plates were beginning to wear out for a lot of these series. So at first, when they started revising them, the first several books, the first 4 came out, but then it kind of jumped around from then on for 1977. So the period went from 59 to 77 over time that they would revise these originals. And so as a plate would begin to wear out or needed replaced, they would do a revision where they would create all new plates. And that's kind of how that sort of went. Also at the time they would revise them, they took the opportunity to, remove, like I mentioned, remove stereotypes and ethnic or racial things, outdated language like the electric lights, things like that. And it gave them that sort of opportunity to just sort of shorten those up. They quickened the pace of them for those attention spans. Some of the books became all new stories, just a few. Some of them added new subplots or maybe removed some subplots from originals to kind of help with that shortening. So it's interesting if you are able to, if you have an original and a revised, to read them side by side and just see how they changed. At my website, I do have a comparison of Old Clock, the original and revised, in the Nancy Drew Revealed section, because it is interesting to sort of study the differences.
I was really surprised that there is no real Carolyn Kane. And I was wondering how did they come up with that name?
So the question, oh, you've got it.
Oh, yeah. So Carolyn Kane, we don't really know. Carolyn had been a name used before for a pseudonym. Kane, perhaps for, Nancy Drew's sort of keen sense of deduction and reason. We're not really sure. It flows very well, obviously. It's part of that whole model that Strathemire used, which if you had this particular pseudonym, many different people could write and you wouldn't realize there's an interruption in, or fans wouldn't think as they're reading these books that it was someone else doing it. They would think it was this magical Carolyn Kane. I didn't really mention for the classic series, there were 8 ghostwriters. Mildred wrote a bunch. Walter Carrick, who I did show you as part of that 30s Drew team. And then Mildred again came back after his last one, kept writing. And then by the late 1940s, early 1950s, there were some issues going on between the syndicate and the publisher. And to make a long story short, the syndicate decided to take the writing mostly in-house. But before they did that, they went through just several different individual ghostwriters for a few books. And so then they did it in-house, and then Staff and Harriet decided to, write these books. And so they had other syndicate partners doing some of the other different series like Hardy Boys and other ones too. And that way they had more control over that side of everything based on different issues they had at a certain point. So, but yeah, many people there is even people I still, run across today who do not realize that Carolyn Kane is a pen name. And so, it's kind of interesting to tell them, oh, no, it's a ghost name, and then talk about the different people that wrote as Carolyn Kane.
Joyce, you had a question? No. Okay. Yeah.
My Nancy Drew book, it's a complete book, but it has 2 stories.
Yeah. So you have a Nancy Drew book that has 2 stories in it. I bet are there many books like that, Jennifer, where they kind of combine stories?
Yeah. I mean, over time in the flashlight version, Penguin did sort of put out a double version of the first 2 books, 1 and 2, Old Clock and Hidden Staircase. I don't know if that's what she's talking about, or the Twin Thriller Book Club editions had 2 stories in each one. And those sort of have that lavender kind of grayish purple color on the cover and the spine with a sort of swirly pattern. And then the back is just like all lavender gray kind of color. And those were a book club edition. And so all but the last 2 of the classic books were printed in that format. So 55 and 56 were not issued as twin thrillers, but so I'm not sure which version she has, but those are the only ones outside of some foreign editions where they would combine. And then there's been a few random special issues in recent years where they've put in maybe 3 books in one that Simon & Schuster did, or some of the different people that were doing these little compilation books. But overall, for classics, it's either the 1, 2, or the twin thrillers.
So you should hang on to that. It's special.
Yeah, those are fun.
Did all of the books that were like produced by that certain company and stuff, they all have pseudonyms? Like everyone, were they all written by ghostwriters?
So
yes, the ghostwriters, yeah. So the syndicate did not publish any under real authors' names. They were all pseudonyms. So the Hardy Boys, some of you may be familiar with, F.W. Dixon was not F.W. Dixon. It was also a pseudonym. So the original Hardy Boys ghostwriter was a Canadian named Leslie McFarlane, who was writing those beginning in 1927. And then they went through another stable of different ghostwriters after him under the same pen name. They were all pseudonyms, the first Strathemire Syndicate series. It's like the Bobbsey twins, Tom Swift, Nancy Drew, the Hardy Boys, the Dana Girls, and other similar series, all had pseudonyms.
All right, I think you had a question?
I read a book that was like maybe number 36 or something. So, and it kind of made sense, but yeah. My husband is like,
did you catch that, Jennifer?
I didn't. What was the question?
The question is, do you need to read the books in order?
Oh, you really don't. I'm one of those people that if there's a series, I'm going to read it in order regardless of that. Just how I am, but you really don't, because all the books sort of have the same sort of pickup formula where you jump into the mystery. It talks a little bit about what she's done in the past, recent mysteries she's solved, introduces the characters pretty well, and then moves forward into the mystery, and then it's resolved, and usually has a next book notice for the next one. But, like if at the beginning, if you start reading them, you'll have Helen Corning, not Bess and George, and then they get introduced later. And then she meets Ned in book number 7. So, if you want to start the first few in order, you'll kind of get a sense of that. But you really don't have to read them in order. So.
And then, Bahoa, did you have a question?
Yes. How many years have you been collecting and researching the Nancy Drew series?
So I began reading them late 70s, more into the early 80s onward. I went off to college in 1991, kind of quit reading, but I still kept them. And then that's sort of in the next 5 to 6 years is when I got interested in collecting and the researching. So I began that by around 97, 98. And so ever since then, over 20, nearly 25 years now, I've been researching and writing about Nancy Drew and really collecting actively. Like I mentioned, I had saved all my childhood books, but I had read quite a few books at my school library. So I didn't have a complete collection of childhood books. I had some that my mom and I would get at the bookstore, which was always fun. And then I read books at the library. So when I began collecting, I kind of went back and was filling in gaps at first because I just wanted one of every book so I could read them again. And then I discovered, there's the original version. So I went down that rabbit hole of finding all the original versions that I didn't really read as a kid. So that was fun.
One more question. Yeah.
Why did they interchange Ted and Ned in the series with the books and the videos and the news reporter? Like the movie Nancy Drew Reporter, they call him Ted instead of Ned. What was the reason for that?
Well, the main reason was they felt like Ned was too old-fashioned at the time. So they didn't want to use Ned. So they changed it to Ted. Just basically thought Ned was too old-fashioned. And of course, today in the CW TV series, I don't know how many of you are watching that, they've been calling him Nick. It's like a nickname for Ned. So.
Any other questions? All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Amy. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you guys again for having me. It was a lot of fun.
We're so fortunate to have such expertise. Just a quick announcement about what's coming next and then a break. I know some of you are gonna go ahead and head off, but I want you to know that we have a few of Jennifer's products for sale in the gift shop. We only have like 10 things. We have some pins and earrings and little zipper bags that are really nice. Also, I wanted to let you know that she mentioned reading different versions of the same book. We, on February 7th, are going to do a book talk, and it will compare The Hidden Staircase, which is, there's 3 different versions of that book at least, and then a couple of different movies. So you can watch or read any of those and enjoy participating in that for February 7th. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, about 10 minutes. Please enjoy some of the activities when you're done with the bathroom. And when we come back, we're going to do a live reading of a Nancy Drew script. It's an actual mystery, and you'll hear how the mystery is solved at the end. I'm going to ask, I have about 3 or 4 reader parts if you would like to be one of the readers. And there's some fun animal parts too, especially if any of you kids are interested. I need a monkey and I need a bird. So you can just come catch me and tell me if you're interested in doing a part in that reading. And that should take about 30 minutes, okay? All right, enjoy your break and we'll get back together shortly. Okay.